Hello? Hello.
Hey, how are you?
Good. I'm doing well.
See what's happening.
Sure, no problem. We'll get started soon. Hello, Michael. Shri, you sound very muted, like almost as if you're underwater or something like that.
How about now?
Yeah, that's much better.
Okay, very good. So can we just give it a couple of minutes, see if anybody else wants to join? And in the meantime, I can update the agenda if you have a link.
Yes, I have the agenda link. I will paste it in the chat.
Plan. Okay, I just copied our planned agenda into it. So,
okay.
was everything live? Are you planning on any upcoming talks for the CNCF events or KubeCon events or MLOps?
Yeah, we got actually a couple of talks into KubeCon Europe. So not by myself, but a couple of other colleagues. So that's cool. Yeah.
That's very nice. That's very nice. Maybe you can plan something for KubeCon, not Europe. Yeah. Obviously, it's too late. But KubeCon NA, North America.
That'd be great. Yeah. So where is that in the world this year?
I don't know. Toronto or someplace maybe I'm mistaken.
All right, cool. So. Sounds good.
Seattle, maybe. I have to check. We put something in for the open source summit, so we'll see what happens. We actually sent a few proposals. So,
cool.
But yes, this new A/B testing stuff that we discussed the other day, hopefully we can get it into a shape that we can demo in KubeCon. That's the big hope. So let's see if that happens.
Yeah, that'd be really cool. It'd be good to get some more thoughts on your client side change as opposed to the other side. Yes, that's the thing we're still trying to get around in our head.
Yeah.
Like I could see it would make sense for things like sort of contextual bandits and stuff. You can't really do that with just traffic splitting percentages. So that you get every single request where it has to go. Obviously, would work perfectly for that sort of case, I'd imagine.
Do you actually have users at that level of maturity who have features, contextual features that can be used for routing?
No, we have people using more boring, I think, multi-arm bandits. I don't actually know of anybody using contextual bandits, but I was just thinking that would be one use case where just sort of messing around with traffic doesn't really work, does it really?
It's funny. Everybody loves to say bandits, but actually usage, people are struggling. That's our experience, at least so far, with very basic stuff. There's a lot of struggle. So it's actually not that hard to implement contextual bandits, but it's just a question of how do you get the inputs for it, and what should the interaction be with the users, clients, browsers, blah blah blah. So
yeah, definitely. But just on a general point, it'd be good to get if there's any sort of summary of the sort of client side as opposed to server side stuff. That seems to be the big change you've made. Yeah, it'd be good to get more info.
Yep. All right. So shall we get started? I think Michael, you're on now. So.
Am I first? Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the new Iter8 GitHub Action. We added this to the GitHub Action Marketplace yesterday. And so I just wanted to sort of go through it and show you how it works. So the action can be used to essentially run Iter8 experiments. So today to load, test, benchmark, and validate HTTP and gRPS services. And the basic usage looks something like this. You're going to use the action. You're going to identify the chart you want, and you're going to provide a configuration file expressed in YAML. And here's an example. This one is referring to the load test HTTP chart, which means this is the experiment that will be run, and it has its own configuration. And one configuration is the endpoint you want to test. And of course, details of that configuration can be found, in the Iter8 documentation. Similarly, for running a gRPC test, and similarly, really for any experiment chart that you have. I just wanted to review quickly the other inputs besides chart and values file. By default, any SLOs that are expressed in the experiment configuration will be validated, but this can be disabled by setting validate SLOs to false. And of course, you can play with the log level. So very simple use for this. I wanted to show you it sort of in practice. So we'll look at the Iter8 end-to-end tests, which are in the Iter8 tools docs repository. And these end-to-end tests have several examples of this. So we test our end-to-end HTTP load test HTTP chart and our load test gRPC chart in this set of tests. And so really these tests are going to start something locally, and then they're going to run several examples. So in the first example, it's creating a config file with just the endpoint. And again, it's that same pattern for using the chart, for using the GitHub action. Similarly, to add SLOs, you just add the SLOs and into the config file. And again, the same pattern for using the chart. The action rather. And for gRPC, again, the test is similar. We're starting something locally, and we create a config chart that identifies the endpoint, what data should be sent, some service level agreements, and then again, the same pattern for using the action. Are there any questions?
So Michael, this is actually one of the big new things enabled by the design change, right? So we don't have a Kubernetes-centered CRD model. We have a client for running an experiment, and the experiment can be run inside Kubernetes. The experiment can be run locally, and it's the local feature that you're using for your GitHub action, right?
Correct. Correct. So the implementation of the GitHub action is just using the client side version of the client side Iter8 that is running the experiment. It's running it locally wherever local is, and in this case, it's in the GitHub workflow, the action runner. And it's using essentially that CLI. It's making sure Iter8 is there. It's running the Iter8 launch command. It's running the Iter8 report command to log the results. And it's running the Iter8 assert command to verify that the SLOs were satisfied. And if those are all successful, then it will proceed with the workflow. And if they fail, then the action in the workflow fails.
So I got another question. When it's an implementation question. So in the GitHub action, you have an Iter8 GitHub action, right? And Iter8 action. So that action is going to, it's spawning its own container somehow as part of the workflow, right? What I'm trying to get to is there any continuity between the previous action and this action? Like, is there any shared context, or like if I let's say set an environment variable in the previous action, is it going to be visible in this action? Or that's what I'm trying to get to.
Okay. So this is an implementation question. And it depends, I believe, on how you implement your actions. We chose to implement this action using so GitHub Actions can be implemented using 2 or 3 ways. One is to use a container, which is what we did. And then you can also implement them in Node, which we did not do. So with the container, what happens is that each time you run the action, the container is run. And so no, there would be no context. I mean, that's not strictly true. Of course, when you run the container, you are loading the current namespace or the current workspace, file system as a shared volume into the container, and anything you write there is probably still visible. But in terms of environment variables, no.
So what? Yeah, exactly. What is the context that is shared between the previous steps in the workflow and this step, the Iter8 action step? It looks like it is if you do a checkout action, then you check out the repo, and that repo's files is the shared context, right?
Yeah, you can see this if you look at the logs for some run that uses the Iter8 action. So really, what's happening is it's calling Docker, and it is sharing the file system basically. But that's all that's being shared. So yes.
I see. You have somewhat, or a tangential question, which is, this is great. I think GitHub Actions is very popular, obviously. So this is great from a GitHub Actions perspective, but how easy is it, for example, to do something like this with the Tekton or with the, I don't know, Jenkins X or whatever it is that people are using?
So in principle, it should be straightforward. The same kind of inputs apply. Tekton uses, again, it's a container-based system. One provides the container you're going to run and the command you want to run in it. That's essentially what we're doing here. We're providing, if we go ahead and we look at the implementation, what we're doing is we're identifying a container that should be run by defining a Docker file, and we're providing a command which is going to run this script, which is, as I said, it runs those Iter8 commands. These Iter8 commands. And the same is true for Tecton. So in principle, it's just a question of writing it for Tecton. For Jenkins X, I think it's the same. I believe they're built using Tecton now. So there's metadata to describe the inputs. There's a container that has to be created, and then there's the command. And I don't know the degree to which, exact same scripts and so on could be used, or if they will need to be modified for each of these environments.
It looks very interesting. Looks very interesting. You have a blog article coming out today or tomorrow, right, Michael?
Should be today.
Okay. Okay, let's see what the reception is like. It should be very interesting.
Here.
So I just have a quick question. Is this, so this isn't just for you guys in your repo, this is for people to use this GitHub action? Like who's the target audience? Is it people developing or is it for anybody?
Yeah, so this is an action. I'm just showing the blog article has been published. This is an action that can be used by anybody. There's no restriction. It is in the open, and we sort of couched it aimed at the current charts that we've made available, which is for load testing HTTP and gRPC services. So we've kind of aimed it in the way we described it in the action in the marketplace, is that it's for load testing. But it is just implemented on top of Iter8, and it uses any Iter8 experiment chart as an input.
All right, cool. Yeah, I'll read it. So what's the idea is I could copy the GitHub action and then use it as part of my CI to load test.
Yes.
My input, whatever I had. Yep.
Yes. Yes. And you don't need, beyond including the action, you don't need to really know anything about Iter8 and how Iter8 works. You just need to know the action. You need to select the right chart. And then you may want to look at how the chart is configured. So different charts may have different configuration.
All right, cool.
So, fast forwarding, let's say 4 months from now, when we do have this A/B testing in this new framework, do you kind of see? Well, I'm wondering what the path is for the A/B testing experiment to show up in GitHub Action. So I launch an A/B testing experiment in my Kubernetes cluster. And then I guess I can do stuff like periodically check if my new version is the winner in the GitHub action, right?
Yeah, I think I'm inclined to think that when we begin running experiments in Kubernetes, which is what you're doing with the A/B testing, that the way we would want to interact with GitHub Actions is through notifications. And so that as experiments maybe finish, they trigger GitHub workflows through notifications to GitHub, which then proceed to take additional steps. I'm not sure it makes sense to attempt to write a part of a workflow that is periodically checking for something, but rather to write that portion of the workflow that responds to the success or failure of such an experiment.
I see. I think this whole GitHub Action business will make sense for users who are pushing the new versions of their applications using GitHub Actions.
Yes.
Right? So if you're using GitHub Actions to, if that is your CI and CD system, and that's what you're using to push new versions of apps into Kubernetes, that's when I would imagine Iter8 experiment interacting with the GitHub Action system in this more complex workflow, going beyond load testing.
Yeah. So if you think about this also, so I showed examples where we're running the service locally. So as part of the GitHub workflow, we're testing it locally. So all of this is happening within the runner. But you can also write this where you create your new version of a service, deploy it to a cluster somewhere, and then run the Iter8 experiment against that cluster. And in this case, you have there is an assumption that you can send the load to the cluster, which means you have an external endpoint that you can communicate with. So it's not a service that is a sort of back-end service on the cluster. If you're running a back-end service on the cluster, then the load test generation itself is going to have to run on that cluster, which means the Iter8 experiment will have to be launched within the cluster itself. This is a case where, again, the workflow can launch this experiment. We have Iter8. We're working on refining this story for Iter8 launching experiments within a cluster. But then you have a choice. Your workflow either pauses and waits for it to complete, or it terminates, and the subsequent promote and cleanup workflows are triggered by notifications once that experiment is finished. So there are alternatives here on how to do it. And the pause and wait is really a question of how long do we really expect such experiments to take?
Yeah, I didn't, correct me if I'm wrong, Clive, but these A/B testing experiments can take weeks because you just need data to come in before you can make a judgment.
As long as the piece of string,
yeah.
Right. So in this case, I would imagine you're using your CI pipeline to deploy the version, and I don't know if that means you're also you're not really starting Iter8 in that case, because I think the assumption is Iter8 has a service for A/B testing.
Yeah.
And so, but the steps that you want to take once the A/B test comes to a conclusion are steps that you want to, again, you don't want to do. You want to push them back to the pipeline, to the CI/CD, and so you want to use notifications to trigger those behaviors, however they work out.
Yeah, I mean the end user here is really a user who is using the CI system, in this case GitHub Actions, to launch a version, launch a new version, and roll back a version. So these are the actions that, it's assumed that the user is doing these things using the CI system today. And, they may be doing it manually. They may be doing it, without any metrics-driven automation or anything like that, without even any A/B testing. We're just telling them, if you if you bring Iter8 in the mix there, then you can make it a bit more intelligent, right? Based on metrics, based on, actual determination of who the winner is. And you can do it that way, and in the process also gradually shift traffic towards the winning version. That's the story that we are really saying, right? In this GitHub Actions integration, that's the story that we are saying.
I think so.
Okay. All right. Very good. Any other thoughts? I can discuss the second part, which is the Kubernetes experiment. They very much work in progress, so you're just going to be seeing kind of a playback, not a real feature, but low-level playback and code walkthroughs. That's what you should expect. Okay, so let's see. I think I need some permissions. Oh.
Do you need me to do anything?
Let me check. Why is Chrome suddenly complaining? What permissions will I need to give it?
You've done this many times.
Yeah. Why is it suddenly starting to something change somewhere?
Is this a system change you have to make to allow it to share?
System preferences.
Yeah, you have to, what is it?
Sorry for all the tech troubles. It does have the permissions, screen recording permissions. Sorry, let me try reconnecting, okay? So maybe that's what I need to do. Give me a second.
Okay. Sri, are you there? Oh,
I don't see him here.
he's trying to use something called companion mode, which I've never heard of before.
Sri, are you there?
Oh. Hello? What is going on?
Because where we work, people are saying, "Oh, we should stop using Zoom and use Google Meets." But it's so good to see that the same problem.
Okay.
Sri, it said you're presenting, but we don't see it.
I mean, I see it, but
okay, but it's not the one that's being shared.
Yeah.
But if I click on it, I see it.
Also, we can't hear him. Oh,
no, he's gone
again.
Hey, Sri.
Oh, no, you're underwater again.
Yeah, you're underwater, Sri, but you are sharing. No, we can't hear you yet.
Is my screen visible?
Yes.
It is.
You sound better.
Very good. Sorry. Okay, so let's try this. Let's start with what the end user experience is, right? For launching Iter8 experiments. Right now, I think the version that we have supports local experiments pretty much. But, surely we will be able to do go run main.go, but really the user will be doing iterate-h. So substitute go run main.go with iterate. User should be able to do launch, run, assert, SLOs, all these things. And there is this ksub command, which is really meant for working with Kubernetes experiments. So let's take a quick look at what that does. Go run main.go k -h. Let's work with Kubernetes Experiments. And oh yeah, so you can do a Kubernetes launch of an experiment. And after you do a Kubernetes launch of an experiment, you can assert if the Kubernetes experiment Kubernetes experiment simply means an experiment running inside the Kubernetes cluster instead of your local machine. That's all. So you can check whether that Kubernetes experiment satisfies whatever conditions SLOs. You can get the logs for the experiment, and you can generate reports out of that Kubernetes experiment, right? So it is the iterate_k command subtree that actually lets you do all those things. And when you do run Kubernetes experiments, you inherit all the standard, features or flags that, a Kubernetes client is expected to support. So if you do kubectl today, you will get all these, kubectl -h. You get a bunch of generic flags to interact with the Kubernetes cluster. And that's exactly what happens with Iter8 also. So when you interact with the Iter8 client, using the Iter8 client, when you interact with the Kubernetes cluster for launching experiments, you get a bunch of generic flags like that for interacting, authentication and other flags for interacting with the Kubernetes cluster. So, so there are a couple of concepts. So when it comes to launch, let's take a closer look. Go run main.go, launch. When you launch a Kubernetes experiment, what happens? All right. Wow, this is super ugly. Okay, so there is a chart name as usual. So Iter8 experiments are now packaged as reusable charts, as we know. So you just provide a chart name. And when you launch this experiment into Kubernetes, you also can associate it with a group, right? So think of it as you have multiple experiments running within the same namespace, let's say for different applications, right? So I have a hello application, I have a flowers application, I have, I don't know, a new recommend shoes application, whatever. So, and I'm having these experiments run for all these different applications, can even be different types of experiments. I have an A/B testing for one application, I have a load testing for another, I have a load test gRPC for a third, and so on. So essentially you can associate a group with an experiment. And the idea is you can launch a series of experiments for a given group, right? So you can launch an experiment for this group. And then after this experiment is over, maybe you have a new experiment, new version of the application coming along. So you want to launch a new experiment. So you just launch a new experiment in the same group, and so on. And really, in terms of implementation, you should be thinking about it as a Helm release, right? So you have a Helm release and you have multiple versions of the same release. So it's a similar concept. And underneath the covers, Iter8 experiments or really experiment charts are really Helm charts. So just like you can do multiple versions of a Helm release, you can do multiple revisions of an Iter8 experiment within a group. So that's the whole idea. So essentially you will be launching something like Iter8 k launch -c. Let's just keep it simple, load test HTTP, and you can now launch it for a group, and let's call this flowers. Okay, so I have a named group called flowers. This is the experiment that I want to launch. Of course, this experiment requires a bit more additional details, like what is the SLOs that you want to satisfy. First of all, what is the URL that you are, experimenting with, load testing in this example. So the URL would be something like, I don't know, flowers dot flowers namespace dot local dot svc dot local. I don't know what the Kubernetes that nomenclature is, but there is some local service running exposing an endpoint here, and that's where you want to load test, and you set the parameter, that URL parameter here, --set SLOs dot mean latency equals, I don't know, I want only 100 millisecond mean latency, -set SLOs dot error count equals 0. I don't want any errors. Okay, so I have to check what the right metric name is, but ignore those details. So this is how you would launch a Kubernetes experiment, right? This is how you would launch a Kubernetes load testing experiment. And let's say you have a new version of the Flowers app. That means it's time to launch a new version of this experiment, right? So you previously had, Flowers v1 and you ran this load test. Now we got Flowers v2 and it's running in the same place, let's say. Then you want to launch a new version of the experiment. You can do exactly the same command and it will simply relaunch. It will just, get you a new experiment for this new application in this same configuration, but it's just a brand new experiment that is running. And you can, that's the whole idea. You have the latest in a series of experiments for a given group. That's all. And if you don't specify a group, that's okay. We'll just give it a default name. So group name will be default. And that's how the experiment will run. This is about the launch, but the assert, report, those are all same as local experiments. So you just do an iterate k assert, iterate k report, and once again, you can give it a group or not. If you don't give it a group, then it will just be a default group. And if you give it a group, then we will fetch the latest in the series of experiments for that group. So let's pause here, see if there are any questions, thoughts on how this new upcoming Kubernetes experimentation feature looks like.
Do I understand group as being a way of relating a set of experiments that were on the same, for the same application together?
Exactly. You see, typically the user is just going to care about the latest experiment for that application, not necessarily all the experiments that they run. They have the latest version of the application and they're running an experiment for the latest version of the application. And so they care about the results for that latest version of the application. So the group kind of hides all the previous revisions of the experiment under it. You don't have to worry. But if you want to interact with a specific revision, you can. That's also possible.
Okay, so that was my next question: is can you relate? Okay, but I guess this also introduced, and I guess the reason that this happens when you're running in Kubernetes is because I guess this is an implementation question. Under the covers, you're running a Kubernetes job or something, and this job runs and completes, but the artifacts are still there. And so you have this history of experiments that have taken place, and by grouping them together, you have a way of relating them. I guess this introduces something we haven't really thought about before, which is it allows you to, in some sense, inspect a history of behavior over a course of iterations, a course of versions.
So, absolutely, yes. By the way, am I audible? I see that my video is paused, but hopefully my audio hasn't.
We do hear you. Okay,
so yes, you can definitely get a history of experiments for a particular group. And it's a kind of a more advanced concept. I haven't really thought through that part yet, but it's a kind of a derivative concept of this group. And yes, that's the natural progression. right? So if you want to look at a trend over time for multiple versions of any metric that you care about for that particular application, this gives you a natural way of doing it, because assuming you have the history of these experiments, you can simply look at that history and you can just plot the trend or do other things, interesting things. But over time, what the metric for this application versions, multiple versions. I kind of, in my head, I am associating each experiment with each version of the application release. So each time you have an application release, you have a new experiment corresponding to it. And so the trend is really across, over time, across the versions for that particular application. That's how I'm kind of relating to it in my head.
So this also introduces then a garbage collection problem.
Of course, that's why I didn't venture into it too deep. So I think there are some quick solutions. I can definitely. I forgot actually. I should add a iterate k delete here. You just wipe out everything associated with a particular group, so the group will just stop existing if you do an iterate k delete. That would be my initial solution. I wouldn't go into, delete one particular version of the experiment, or, I ran 10 experiments, delete the 7th version. I wouldn't do all that to begin with. I don't care about this group anymore, just wipe out this group. So that's probably what we can introduce to begin with. And then we can take it from there, iteratively. That, at least it gives you some way to clean out your experiments entirely. You see, the other design consideration here I was thinking about is you have a version and you have an experiment running for this version. This is true for long-running experiments, like A/B testing experiments, okay? That's where this comment makes more sense. And you for whatever reason, you decided to launch a new version even before your experiment is over, simply because, you think you have a better service, better model, whatever. So you just launched a new version, and you want to go to a next experiment, right? At the stage, you should not be thinking about what happens to my previous experiment, right? The previous experiment is just gone, and the new experiment just takes over, and you have a new experiment beginning to run. And if you have some partial results from the previous experiment that is still persisted, so at whatever half-baked state the previous experiment was, you will still get to keep those, half-baked results. Whatever was generated, you will still keep those results, but you now have a new experiment running in the cluster. And that's the experiment that you care about, because this is the experiment for the latest version of your application, and this is the version that you suddenly start caring about. So this is the experiment that you need to care about. I don't want the user to go through this complexity. You go through this reasoning, they should not have to worry about what happens to the previous experiment, what happens to, how do I garbage collect it before I launch a new experiment. I don't want the user to be worrying about it. So the iterate launch kind of hides all of that complexity under the covers, right? So you just, when you launch, the new experiment simply takes over. And if there is a previous version of the experiment that is running, essentially you just move on. In a sense, you can think of it as you pause that experiment, you stop that experiment, and you relaunch a new experiment with whatever, the new configuration or for the new version of the application. That's the way to think about this new, this launch capability. So you have to look at this grouping behavior in this light. You have a group, and you just have a series of experiments in that group, and it is possible to just abruptly stop a current experiment and launch a new one, simply because you want to do that, because you have a new version and you don't care about the old version anymore, and you just want to launch a new experiment for your new version. As I said, this consideration is important, I think, for long-running experiments where there's a greater chance of new versions coming along in the middle of an experiment, and which means you have to supersede the old experiment. These are all things, usability aspects that We don't want to push on the top of the user's heads, because those are all the kind of things that makes Iter8 difficult to use, if the user has to think through all those things. So the design choice I made here is that you don't have to think about all those things. When you launch, you just get a new experiment, and it will just wipe out any existing run that you have for that group. Of course, you may have other groups and other experiments running, and we won't bother them. But for this group, if you have something ongoing, it will just, you know, it will be a new one. That's all. You get a fresh experiment, it will take over.
So I think then this has, I guess it's a configuration somewhere. It seems to me that this also enables, when you introduce a new version, as you described, you sort of terminate previous experiment. You're saying you don't care about the previous version. I suppose there are cases where you do care. You've introduced a new version, you now have 3 versions. You want to test all 3 versions. You also have the case where you introduce a new version because you don't want the previous version anymore at all. You actually don't want to include it in a test. And it seems like all of these are reasonable possibilities to consider here.
They're all reasonable. ABN experiments exactly is what you're referring to. Yeah. But I would argue even in that case, you don't care about the previous experiment.
Agreed.
So agreed. Versions, and so you still want to launch an experiment, which just wipes out whatever older one. I'm not saying lose all the data for the previous versions. I'm just saying you have a new type of you want to compare 3 instead of 2, so you just take over. That's all.
Agreed. That you're changing the experiment. I agree with that. It's just your response to the set of versions that are available, and what you're testing depends on what it is you're trying to do here. You introduce new versions for multiple reasons. One is because an existing version was wrong or a mistake or something, but you also introduce them because you just have another variation that you want to include and begin to test with.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think also this notion of terminating experiments, we were speaking previously with actions and the notion of notification. And so I think there's a question there, what happens when experiments are running and are terminated? Does it even matter? I don't know. It seems like it does matter, because there are often steps you want to take. If you terminate an experiment because you've replaced a version, there are cleanup steps you want to take to delete the remnants of the experimental version that you had running.
Do you? Do you care?
Maybe you do. Why wouldn't you care? Why do you want a lot of versions of something running?
No, you only have 1 version of the experiment running.
I'm not talking about cleaning up experiments. I'm talking about versions of application or models.
Yeah, this is how we complicate our story. So why should we care about it? That's what I'm trying to say. We iterate. Today you have a way of cleaning up application versions. So
we do. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying in order to enable users to automate that cleanup, we need to think through when notifications should be issued from these kinds of experiments.
Yeah, agreed.
That's what I'm saying.
Agreed.
I agree. We're not going to do cleanup of versions, but we do need to allow them to do that. They're running these experiments in a cluster somewhere. There needs to be a means of communication. And what are the events here is the question. It was easy if it was just an experiment completes. But now we have experiments complete, but experiments also are interrupted.
Agreed. So, okay. Okay, so yeah, I agree, Michael. That is a consideration for notifications. We're still not there. We haven't really.
Yeah. No, these are the implications of this kind of design. Is all I'm thinking.
Yes, I agree. Okay, so we got 10 minutes. Any questions or thoughts here before we move on? I think, Alan, you have a port that you wanted to show.
Yeah. Can I do that?
Yeah, let me start presenting.
So yeah, I've been working on this collect database task, this one over here, which will make it easy for us to collect metrics from many different platforms. So for example, we're working on Istio, Code Engine, Linkerd, anything, right? It's a very flexible system. Basically, it consumes this metrics file over here, and this is actually a template that makes it easy to well, maybe I can just talk about what's in it. So you can point to a URL. Let me make this a little bit bigger. So you can point to a URL. You can define what kind of headers are required to query for metrics, as well as all the different metrics that are available. And you can see here, you can define a name, the type of metric it is, give a description, parameters. You can also, if in a request you need to use a request body, that's also available. This is just like a very flexible system for you to make HTTP calls to.
So, quick question, Alan. I think the idea here that I remember us discussing this a long time ago. The idea is not that the end user is providing all these things, right? The idea is that developers provide these templates. And the end user can just say with just like iterate, launch, experiment, and maybe it's a mirroring experiment or it's A/B testing experiment with some values, right? So you could use for istio prom URL equals and give the Prometheus URL and boom, done. So that's the whole idea here, right? So you have templatized the whole thing.
We want to make templates for all these different platforms. So the user just needs to provide some very basic values. For example, the URL, some authorization details, and then perhaps which versions they want to test. And then it should just all work. So for example, this is a bit of a work in progress, but I do have like this very simple experiment set up where I am basically just querying for one of my code engine applications, and it's able to get some metrics. So I think actually I need to get a new token because these tokens expire quite quickly. And I'm putting it into my file over here. This should be less manual in the final version, but if I now just run my experiment, iterate, run, we're able to collect some metrics. So if I do iterate report, you can see here, we can see that since this starting time, there have been 15 requests. So
that's nice. That's nice.
Yeah. You can see here, I wanted to show more, like for example, with SLOs, right? But the issue is there could be a number of reasons why we don't get metric values. So for example, you see here, we're not able to collect error count and error rate because there weren't any errors. We didn't have any, the application didn't have any kind of errors, right? And so when I tried doing, for example, iterate report, output HTML, put that into, let's say, report.html. Oh wait, I mean, I just changed this now. I would need to rerun the experiment, but I guess I can show you what this looks like. Yes, we can see that we're able to get some metrics, right, 15. But if I were to rerun this experiment with the changes that I made, that will fail because we don't have, oh wait, oops, sorry. Oh, I don't know what's going on. Maybe I'm just going insane. Huh. I was having problems with
Alan.
Oh, I didn't save it. That's why. All right. Anyway.
So before we close out the meeting, right?
Yeah.
So, Clive, this is actually a very interesting capability that Alan is showing here. I don't know if you made the connection, but we could just create a Selden template for bringing metrics from the standard Selden way of pushing metrics to Prometheus. And all that the user would have to do, if you mandate, for example, some A/B testing reward metric format, saying, use this format, call it reward. Let's just say call it reward. Okay, and you name your reward metrics as a reward, or reward 1, or reward 2, some convention. Then we can just create a template. And everything here is a little bit work in progress. But if you combine what Alan showed, and if you combine what I showed, you can essentially launch a very simple experiment, iterate k launch, and provide just a couple of values like, my version A dot service name, version B dot service name, and maybe my Prometheus URL for Selden. And that's all the user has to do to run an A/B testing experiment. And the experiment will fetch the metrics, and maybe it will just report who's winning. Let's not worry about this bandit business, which is the most complex part of this whole thing yet. But if you just want to compare versions, and if you just want to declare winner, and let's say, and you can still do some advanced statistics in terms of how confident you are in your winner estimation. You can still do that even without the bandits, and you can declare the winning version. You can already start doing some very interesting things with just a single line command without having to do anything complex.
No, yeah, it sounds interesting. So just to check, this is still using the traffic split way of doing stuff, is it? It's not using the client-side stuff, what you're talking about.
This is still not showing you the traffic. It is not doing the traffic split on its own. The assumption is you have installed, I don't know, you have your Selden new CRs that you're working on that's doing a traffic split, or you're using Istio or Ambassador, whatever it is that you use to do the traffic split.
Well, I mean the traffic, the change of traffic is the way this would work, not the client side, every individual request.
No, but there is still a value in the client side, right? Because you can still use this experiment to compare versions. You're right. This experiment is not the way I described it is not showing you how to split traffic, but it is still letting you do an A/B testing experiment with a fixed split.
All right. Okay. I'm just trying to understand, because you've got two varieties now, the client side and the server side, but I realize we've only got 1 minute.
All right, so I think we can touch base again on this particular capability and what it means for A/B testing. I think there is something here for us to expose in the short term without having to create that server-side capability. There is still something here that we can do. This is the same as the old version. Our CRD version model is doing exactly this, right? It's fetching metrics from DB, and it's comparing versions and doing stuff. We can use this to do it just more of the same. That's all. It's just made it a little easier. Just launch the experiment in an easier way. That's all that it is doing. This is just exactly the same as before.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
All right. So
Yeah, we're
this
running
is
out of time.
excellent. Yeah, we're running out of time. So let's touch base again. We'll keep going, and this is really nice.
Okay, cool.
Okay, cheers. That's really interesting. Thanks.
Yep. Bye bye.